Welcome, everyone. Appreciate you guys being here today. My name is Bob Jackman. I'm with Domo. This session is downsizing data flows and upsizing value. So I'd like to introduce the presenter. This is Ryan Wilson. He's the CTO of Build Intelligence. They started out as a customer, moved to a partner role. Ryan is probably best known as having the most support tickets and the most feature requests. So he's been in there, he's diving in a lot. He's got a lot of great features to share with you. So let me introduce Ryan Wilson.
All right, well, I'm going to give you guys kind of a quick introduction of where I came from and how I ended up speaking here. And I'm going to condense it down and really keep it to what's relevant to this presentation here. So where it all kind of started for me in data analytics, data science was back in college. I got a degree in biochemistry and I was a cross-country track and field athlete. And we'd be getting on the bus for practice and the typical conversation was, oh, how far are you running today? How many miles are you running today? But then it'd get to me and coach would be like, how many watches are you wearing today, Ryan? And I'd be like, 3 today. And I was fascinated by the fact that like GPS watches for running, the actual sensor in them is accurate to about 10 meters. But I could get done with my run and consistently know which side of the block I was running on, which side of the street I was running on. So I was very curious as to kind of like, well, how are they doing that? Kind of that curiosity eventually led me to getting more jobs kind of in the kind of data analytics and kind of analytical sciences. So after University of Portland, I worked in semiconductors for a while doing data analytics in semiconductors, kind of focusing in on quality control. It's kind of my first experience with very large-scale databases, very fine-tuned, super detailed data. I eventually got bored of that and was looking kind of for my next challenge. So I kind of was looking where I'm going to go next and kind of being really into running. I moved to Bend, Oregon to find some mountains to run. And it was actually running up in the mountains where I first heard of Domo. I was on a run and I was talking about like whatever GPS watch I was wearing at the time, and one of the guys I was running with looks over and he's like, so you ever heard of Domo? I'm like, no. And eventually that led me to a position Arbor builder. They've been using Domo for about 4 years now, and I was hired to come in and replace a kind of external consultant that had been partnering with Domo and kind of been providing a lot of the data flow work there and moving kind of that workload more internally so we could move through it faster, build it out more, make it more robust. What ended up happening is like the excitement kind of around that ended up turning into a business opportunity for us. It was, hey, this stuff we're doing is really great and our industry is, everyone is wanting this. So we came down to Salt Lake, we went through all the partner training, we're here for a while, and we started Build Intelligence. So now I've worked with about 19 different home builders building out data flows, visualization solutions for them. And what I do now is I really focus in on, we've been hearing all week kind of the power of the platform. Like, what does that actually mean? Like, where can we get value? What can we do in here? And there's a lot of things you can do with Domo. Like, I got curious once and I was like, I wonder if I can make a 3D engine out of a Domo data flow. And it turns out I figured out how to do it. I don't think the clicker's getting this video to play. With Domo custom apps, With Domo custom apps, we can visualize anything we want in any way we want. I've been able to render water in a Domo custom app kind of thing. Now, that's not necessarily something that provides value to anyone other than the only value really from kind of these two examples I have up here is you guys might have a funny story to tell when you go back to your office, like, okay, there's a guy here that was using Domo to make a graphics engine and do that. Like, it's crazy kind of what you can actually do with the platform. But it's good to know that, but really what we're after is getting value of it. How can we better the business? How can we go from there? So I believe the best way to drive value from the Domo platform starts in the data center. It starts with building out a very well organized kind of data center city. When I first started getting into Domo, I was so excited because I was getting out of working with all these data silos where it was really hard to get all the information just into one spot so I could do the reporting that everyone was asking for. And so I was excited to jump right into Domo. But what ended up kind of happening is I jumped into someone who'd already been implemented a little bit and, well, okay, I'm out of silos, but now I feel kind of like I'm stuck in the suburbs. I'm like trying to find this data and it's kind of already grouped into these really kind of repetitive, really similar looking structures there. So I thought, we can do much better here. So what we really want is we really want to be able to get our data where it needs to go in a quick, organized way. And what we kind of want to do is we want to break out from these suburbs and we start wanting to build kind of freeways, kind of on-ramps to get on here, off-ramps to get off, and really start to organize our data center around kind of particular spots in order to make it easy to build off of it, maintain it, and go from there. So I've already kind of mentioned a couple of these problems, like what's been done already? Where has someone already built the logic out to combine this data somewhere? Do I need to add new data that's not in Domo? Has that been done somewhere? When it comes to building a visualization, when someone has a request, do we already have something that does this, or do I need to build something? There's just a lot of kind of friction that can happen there if we're not kind of thinking a little bit about how we're actually organizing out this data center. So the first spot I look at when I'm looking at building out this data center city, we're trying to build these highways to really kind of be these central points around building our entire visualizations out, bringing all our data together there. So building out data flows to produce an output by a dimension ends up being a very good way to start to rationalize this and move toward this. And every business is going to have several kind of key dimensions, and it's usually pretty apparent from some of the ubiquitous language you hear around. But the idea is if we kind of centralize these data flows around these dimensions, we can start building one data set that has tons and tons of cards built off of it. Now, in this example I have up here, I have it over here, it's kind of circled, 217 cards. For Arbor builders, where this example is from, that's a lot of cards. That's about 8% of the cards in their instance as of this morning. So one data set of their 3,000 is creating 8.9% of their cards. I've seen data sets that have upwards of 6,500 cards built off of them. But really the value isn't necessarily in getting a bigger and bigger number. Kind of where the value comes in, I think, really where you see this in the business is how quickly it takes for a request for a new card to come in to actually putting this on a dashboard and getting it approved and having people being able to leverage and utilize it right there. So about 3 weeks ago, I'm in a meeting with the division managers of Arbor builders, and they're kind of discussing some big problems and trying to strategize how we get around this. And our production manager was talking about the problem that he saw coming up, and using Domo, he was saying, okay, well, here's what I think we should do. Does anyone have any other ideas? And head of finance had an idea, and it was looking at something we'd never really kind of visualized or thought of like looking at in Domo. And so he asked this question, and the production manager's like, oh, that's a pretty good idea. Let's go with that. And then the president of the company kind of turns over and looks at me, and he's like, hey, Ryan, can we build a card for that? And I just kind of look at him and smile, and then everyone else in the room starts looking at me, and he's like, so can we get a card for that? I'm like, refresh your page. Once I heard the head of finance ask the question, I already knew, hey, we have this data set built around this dimension. I already know we have this data in here. I didn't have to spend my time going, what's been built? What's out there? Do we have the data already in there? I already knew that. I was spending my time on, okay, what's the best way to visualize this? Okay, got it. Now, certainly I can't, sit there in every meeting and nothing up my sleeves. Is this your card? That'd be great, but I'm not a magician. That's probably actually a good thing, because apparently magicians don't reveal their secrets, and I'm trying to reveal my secrets here to you guys. What usually happens is I'll get asked, can we get a card? And I'll be like, yes. Because of the way I know we've organized our data flows and everything, I can be pretty confident, yes, I think I can have that by the end of the day. Or, yes, I should be able to have that by the end of the week. Or it might be something where, like, because of the way we've organized our data flows, I can kind of know based off the question, well, I don't think we have that information kind of connected in quite yet. I think we should be able to do that pretty quickly. I'm just going to tag in one of my technical consultants right here on this conversation so he can look into it while we continue on with the meeting, and I'll try to have an answer for you by the end, like when we can have it, that sort of thing. And it also means that I can quickly go from getting a request to, oh no, we don't have that data. Let's figure out how we can start collecting that, how we can start pulling that in and answering questions based off of it. So maybe you're new to a company, just coming in, and well, what are my business's dimensions kind of thing? Here's a couple spots you can kind of look for to see some of your business's dimensions. If you look at the names of some of the existing cards, a lot of times you'll start to see some cards that maybe would say something like something by something else. A lot of these times when you end a card's title with by something, you're talking about a dimension that is important to someone in your company. The other kind of spots you can look are in quick filters. A lot of times some of your key dimensions are used in quick filters, and also in kind of the series for the cards that are doing some of the color highlighting there. Another spot is on bar charts. Often the x-axis will be actual dimension categories. So you can see some right there. And usually these jump out a lot because they're terms that people are talking about pretty frequently in your business. So not every single dimension you'll ever see in Domo is worth really building a bunch of infrastructure around, but organizing your data flows kind of around some of your key dimensions ends up being a pretty powerful way to move a lot of the work from, okay, well, do we have this data in here? Do we need to build a new data flow for this, that, to really focusing a lot on, okay, what dashboards do we need to build? Like, what visualizations do we need to build? What new data might we need to pull through and visualize that we haven't visualized before for these? So all right, so we kind of have our dimensions dialed in. Where do we start? There's a couple patterns that jump out to me when I'm building out data flows for other Domo customers. The first one is kind of this freeway pattern. So you kind of have one primary, highway, and you start kind of building these on-ramps to bring in other data sources and move towards an end result, and that end of the data flow is the production data set you're building a bunch of cards around. In kind of the example of Arbor builders and the construction industry, the kind of dimension that we focus on a lot is like a construction job. So, with this freeway pattern, you might see something like the jobs table data flow 1 of 4, and then there's an on-ramp in kind of the 2 of 4, and maybe this is where we're going to bring in construction scheduling activities. This is kind of where we're on-ramping this here. And then we might have a follow-up data flow right after that, and that's where we're going to kind of on-ramp some of our sales data, some of our leads, opportunities, that sort of thing. And by doing it this way, it makes it so when we get new data, a new data source that we maybe previously didn't have, or maybe it's the case where we had one vendor and we switched to another vendor. We kind of have one spot where we know to go and look. And in the case of replacing a vendor, it's easy. It's like, okay, well, we had this vendor doing our sales and kind of lead opportunity CRM type stuff. This is where we need to go to replace it for jobs. We kind of don't have to go, okay, well, let's go to these data sets and look what all the data flows are using this. You kind of have a general idea of where data is being used in your data center itself. So even just thinking about switching to a different vendor is easier to grasp. Adding new data. Maybe you didn't previously have a bunch of digital marketing and you're just getting into that, and okay, well, now we want to kind of tie this in and we want to see some of our digital marketing stuff by job. Well, we can kind of follow this and we can build the freeway out and add it in there and bring it through to the cards. And now if someone asks, hey, how effective is our Facebook campaigns for these jobs? It's like, okay, well, I know what data set I need to pull to build a card. There's no confusion there. It's, okay, I know where I need to pull to build the visualization. I know where I need to pull new columns through if I need to pull more data through. So it can end up being a really powerful way to organize your data flows and combine a bunch of data sources. So this example right here, I've streamlined it a bit. The real actual production version of this for Arbor builders has about 100 different data sources. And they're all coming in kind of on these on-ramps, separate data flows. So it's very, very kind of concise. When we need to add new data in, we can go, okay, we have some new sales data. We've been putting sales data in right here. We can come in there. We can rename all our columns right there in one spot, so we don't have to go looking all over the place for various columns being renamed. The next pattern that stands out when I come back and look through a lot of the data centers that have been well organized. It's kind of more of a pine tree pattern. And that's kind of what it looks like to me if you turn this on its side here. You kind of get a little diagram that kind of starts to look like branches off a little pine tree. Where this pattern comes into really good use is anytime you start seeing a bunch of data flows or data sets that are all very similar. Usually they'll like end with the same thing and they'll be kind of like from a different source. They might all be very similar data, but you might need some, a little bit of a specific tweak here or there. But then the overwhelming majority of the logic is actually shared across all of them. So in this example here, I'm looking at kind of goals versus actuals. So we share an office with several other businesses that we're helping out with Domo. We have a car wash business, there's a tax foreclosures business, there's Arbor builders. So we have several builders in there. We have several companies, and they're all wanting to look at kind of goals versus actuals. And all of the different companies really have different things their goals are centered around. But by kind of building out individual data flows for each of those to handle just their separate logic, and then appending them all together and bringing them all in a unified schema, and then processing all the logic that's shared across them. If we decide a month from now, hey, we kind of want to tweak this, a little bit right here for all our goals versus actuals data flows, there's one spot we have to go to. It's not, oh, I'm managing 12 car washes, now I have to go into 12 data flows and change it 12 times here. Did I remember to change it for car wash A, but not car wash B? Really consolidating that down makes it easier just to manage and build and further kind of leverage value from the data flows themselves. So just to kind of rehash, this kind of organizing these data flows around these patterns, kind of really starting to centralize this makes it so we can build a bunch of cards off of less output. So there's kind of like this, there's less like confusion around multi-teams or multi-department teams. A lot of the companies I work with, like I will be talking directly to like the president of the company or a division manager, or sometimes it's even just one of the normal employees down at the bottom of the org chart. But by organizing it in this way, we can start to make it so they can leverage Domo. They can leverage what we've already built out in the data center to build out new cards themselves without even having to go to like the technical experts, all the visualization gurus in the company, and asking for a card themselves. It really starts to enable the entire company to be able to start actually building out visualizations to answer business problems. So now that we kind of have an idea of what some of these patterns look like, what happens as these things start to grow out? How do I keep this manageable? Well, what I came into was this jobs table. And it started off pretty simple. And these charts I'm about to show right here, each point is a data flow. So it started off pretty simple. There's a couple leading up to it. But then there was a little bit more. And then I look into it a little bit more and I'm like, okay, it's a little bit bigger than I thought. And then I'm looking over at the president of the company. I'm like, I don't know if you're a genius or insane, but we need to clean this up. We need to make this easy to manage. So where do you even start when you have such a giant like spider web of data flows, and you're trying to organize this. Well, the first place I start is naming things better, renaming things. Naming is a super easy thing to overlook, but is super important in maintaining like organization through your data center, through the visualizations, as well as making it easy to understand. What can happen is, Magic ETL is great because it's simple, but it can be deceptively simple sometimes. Sometimes you can look at it and it seems like it's a foreign language. For example, maybe we're looking at this data flow here and we see, okay, we have an input that is production color data. It's a pretty simple data flow. There's 4 tiles in it. But we kind of go to the value mapper and then we open it up and we're like, wait, I only speak English. What's going on here? I don't even know what's going on here. But even if we all did, even if it was written in English, it's not always apparent what's going on. So if we look at this case, this value mapper is looking at color, and we see it's mapping pink to yellow and brown to green. So now I'm like, okay, wait. Before, I was like, okay, I don't even understand what's happening. I'm just going to go find who did this. But now I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, wait. I understand what these words are doing, but why are they doing? What is going on? I don't even know where to begin. If we were to have named that tile from the start, why it's there, what it's doing, even if we can't understand exactly what the details of what's happening are, we can know why that's there and if it's something that's going to affect maybe another data source we're bringing in to this data flow. Just by naming this tile, fix entries from colorblind employees. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, now I see why they were changing pink to yellow and, brown to green kind of thing. But without just that, one little name there, what makes sense now can look, confusing down the road. So when it comes to naming some of these tiles, the few I look for that are kind of quick wins are constant tiles, filter tiles, and value map tiles. So let's say you're coming into a data flow that maybe you inherited from another person that built it out, or maybe it's something you built a long time ago and you're kind of looking back at it and like, well, I don't really even remember what I was doing here. One step that anyone can do to make this easier to understand is just to start naming some of these tiles like exactly what they're doing. So for example, for a constant tile, you can name it the constant, and then you can go equals, and then what it's setting that constant to. For filter tiles, you can kind of talk about what the filter's doing. For value mapper tiles, you can try to summarize what it's doing right there. And that step alone makes it so you can scan through the data flow and kind of quickly see what's going on a little bit better. Where we can go from there is then figuring out kind of not the what of the tile, but the why. Having the why there, that's what's very powerful. That's kind of what you want to aim for in some of these tiles. If I have a filter tile that's saying, okay, filter out GL account numbers less than 3,500 and more than 3,000, well, okay, depending on what company you're at, that's a different thing. That is pretty much unique to whatever company you're at, kind of thing. But if I had named it differently, if I had named it GL accounts for revenue, even if we switched our accounting system up, I could kind of go back, look at that data flow and know, okay, that's what this person was trying to accomplish when they did that. That's what I was trying to accomplish, a year ago when I built this data flow and then forgot what I was doing when I built this data flow. So if there's one thing that can really make building out data flows, maintaining data flows easier for the entirety of anyone building data flows, anyone on your team, whether it's onboarding new people, just trying to figure out what you did, or in a situation where maybe multiple people on the same team will be working on one data flow across its use, it just makes it easier to understand what's going on, make sure you account for what things were being done to fix some data from one system, and make sure you kind of don't let things slip through that should have actually gone through like a value mapper earlier on that you didn't realize because you couldn't really understand what it was doing or why it was there. So the next thing to look for is look for where you're repeating logic. So anywhere you're kind of repeating logic, you want to start bringing that all together down into one place. So you don't have to go searching for multiple places where you need to adjust the logic if you ever need to change a value mapper. You'd rather change it in one spot rather than having to hunt down 8 different spots and make sure they're all updated to the new way you want to do it. What's great about naming your tiles first is if you're very consistent about how you're naming tiles, Domo will actually point out to you when you're repeating logic, because it'll say, hey, you've already named a tile this, so we're taking whatever you named it and we're going to add a number to the end. So just by renaming your tiles, you can even start to spot some spots logic is happening multiple times. The spot I see the most that you can kind of collapse a bunch of tiles down into less tiles is when you see like a bunch of stacked filters on top of each other followed by a constant. A lot of times what I see is these filters are just like filtering on one column. They're just looking for like a different set of values so they can add a constant, kind of normalize some of this stuff here. If it's just one column you're filtering on to create these constants afterwards, you can take all those tiles and accomplish the same thing just using one value mapper tile. So not only do you end up saving a bunch of time running these data flows as they're being used in production, but going back and adding another one to the list is easier to do because you can scan through the list and see, hey, has someone already added this here? Oh no, they haven't, I'll just add it at the bottom here. Or it's, oh, we don't really need these anymore, or, oh, this category is actually kind of two, we need to really separate these out. It's much easier to do that with one tile. And also, if you're just looking through a data flow, it's much easier to understand the data flow because you're kind of seeing one logical step being processed as one tile rather than kind of this kind of one piece of logic here is actually like 12 tiles stacked on top of each other in a row. All right, so now we've kind of organized our data flows and kind of how they're chained together, kind of built out, how they're organized. We saw good ways to identify spots where we're repeating logic and reduce the number of tiles we're actually looking at in these data flows. So now let's look at actually kind of optimizing these things to run faster. So where do we start here? So first spot I start is I start for looking for spots in data flow chains where we're using the same input more than once. Because if we're using the same input in a couple data flows in a row, it's likely that we're repeating some logic somewhere, and it might be the case where we want to actually bring this down into the first spot it's used and pull it all the way through the chain rather than keep pulling in these rows and reprocessing them as we're going through these chains. Next thing I look for is repeated logic within the data flows. If we kind of condense down a number of these tiles, often we can actually get the data flows to run faster because there's not a lot of additional processing being done that's unnecessary. And then kind of the next step I go from there is, once again, renaming these tiles. If I can start to see like what's going on, where logic might be repeated, or even where we might be able to condense down the logic to be done in a simpler way. Now, you might already be thinking, wait, weren't those the same steps to making your data flow smaller? And the answer there is yes. Just by kind of making our data flow smaller and easier to read and understand for anyone that's going into those data flows and looking at them, whether it's you yourself going back and updating these, or a different person on the team, or a new person that wasn't around when this was built. You've already done the work to get a bulk amount of optimizations for your data flows just by making it easier to read, maintain, and build from there. So when it kind of comes to optimizing these data flows, the way I kind of like to look at it is not everything worth doing is worth doing well. And what I mean by that is, why are we using Domo data flows in the first place? We're using it because we're trying to get some business value. We're trying to answer questions here. We're trying to solve business problems. If the amount of time it takes for that data flow to run is not the business problem you're trying to solve, well, then you're better off not thinking about optimization until it is a problem. Because a lot of these things are much better suited to be easier to read, easier to maintain, and taking 15 minutes to run instead of 13 minutes to run, or 10 minutes to run. Or maybe you get really clever and really tricky and you're able to get it to run down in 2 minutes. If a data flow being updated within 15-minute windows isn't a problem, then we don't really need to make our data flows more confusing to address those problems. Now, certainly there's situations where you do have data flows that are, okay, we need this to update every 5 minutes. Waiting 15 minutes is too long. Well, then that is your business problem. That's a problem you're trying to address. So looking for ways to speed it up, even if it's sacrificing a little bit of readability for making it a bit faster is the way to go. So, kind of the key takeaway here is when you're building out these data flows, focus on solving your business problems. Focus on answering the questions and making these data flows as easy to understand as possible. What you'll find is most of the time that just by doing that, the data flows will already be running pretty fast. And as time goes on, you even get kind of free speed boosts in how fast your data flows run as kind of the underlying technology gets faster and increases. An example of this is when I came on to the team at Arbor Builders, they had a Redshift data flow that they were using for several things, and it would take anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes to run. Well, Magic ETL came out with a rank and window tile, and I was like, well, you know what, let's move this Redshift data flow actually within the data flow we're using it, so the business people that aren't necessarily technical experts can really understand what's going on here more and really help to bring more data in or build out this data further there. And what we found when we replaced it is a data flow that took 20 minutes, and that took like 2 seconds to run in a Magic ETL tile just because of the differences in how we were setting it up. The end result was the same kind of data processing being done, but it was done in a much cleaner, more consistent way. So, okay, where should you start looking if the speed a data flow takes is a business problem? There's a lot of great resources in the Domo Knowledge Center around building fast data flows. The Domo Dojo is a great place to ask questions about how to speed it up. Domo channel partners. Domo partners can often help consult very specific cases for data flows right in there. Or even just reaching out to your CSM and asking them to look into, hey, is there anyone that could help me figure out how to make this go faster? We're really having this problem here. Those are kind of the next steps to take once you've identified like, okay, this is a business problem. This data flow needs to run faster than making it as readable as possible aloud. So to kind of summarize everything I've gone over so far, where we want to be to kind of be in this well-architected data center city is we want to build these data flows by dimension. We want to set up our highways, and we want to use those highways to organize where we're pulling in new data sources and where we're building visualizations off. Naming is very important for readability, understandability, and maintainability. So renaming tiles is something that only takes a few seconds of extra work while you're building the data flow, but can save dozens of minutes later if you just need to go do a quick chain and you can't really remember what was going on in the data flow. And it might even save hours when you come back to a complicated data flow and are really trying to figure out what was going on here. Kind of the last piece is, focus on solving your business problems before you focus on making your data flows run as fast as possible. If you focus on making your data flows readable and maintainable, you usually end up with data flows that are fast enough to solve your business requirements without really any cons associated with it. And it's much easier to build new features into those data flows, pull more data in, add new people to your team and get them kind of onboarded. What we don't want to do is we don't want to build like a 4-lane highway so you can drive up the street and visit your neighbor. That's not what we want to spend our resources doing. We want to spend our resources, maybe making a bypass around the city so we can get all our data from one side to the other quickly. All right, thank you, everyone. Is there any questions?
Mike, to you.
You mentioned finding data sets that had similar dimensions, so like similar column names and maybe even row counts. I can think of a couple of examples that I've worked with where it's literally the exact same report, but it's just 2 different time grains that could be joined together or possibly even brought into Domo a different way. But the only reason I knew that is because I actually had to look manually through all of the data sets. So I was wondering if you knew of a better way to find these tables that have similar dimensions, or if there's a tool I just don't know about.
I'd say probably one way you could tackle that is there is a connector in the Domo App Store that's like Domo Stats. You can use that to pull in like a card of like data flow names, data set names. And one thing you can start to do is from a card view there, start to try to group these by name, and maybe just have a card that's sorted alphabetically. A lot of times these data sets that are similar dimensions will usually be named fairly similarly, so you can kind of find these a little bit better. I can't remember if that Domo Stats connector also gives you column names for data sets as well, but that'd be the other place to look there. As far as your comment about like time grains, usually what we try to do is we try to like normalize it to one time grain, usually the smallest time grain we can pull out, but that's not always possible if you have a lot of inputs that are already aggregated at a time grain and you can't get the kind of raw underlying data there.
Yeah, considering a particular business dimension, if I think about the data sets that are contained in that dimension, I'm wondering what you found useful in documenting it. You've talked about naming data flows. Have you found other documentation of the data sets and the meaning of the fields useful?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as far as naming data flows themselves, we've changed around a couple times with how we do it because we kind of go with one naming pattern and then we kind of find something that just internally in our company we don't like the way that turns out. So the current way we do it is if it's kind of this data flow freeway kind of style of organization, what we'll do is we'll put in square brackets at the very front of the data flow name a number, and then we'll have kind of the name of the data flow, and then we'll have kind of a small additional like description, if applicable, like right at the end there. So for example, we have like in square brackets 1 jobs table, 2 jobs table. So that's how we've named some data sets there. As far as actually like documenting it further than that, with column names, we try to rename all the column names to a kind of our standardized what we want to call them as early as possible. So if that means bringing in a new data source, we try to rename those columns to what we want them to be called right after the input rather than further down the line and okay, wait, now we have to make sure we lined up all these things that maybe we joined or appended together and make sure we then rename them. It makes it easier to kind of follow along when you're looking through the data flows because the names don't flip-flop a bunch. They kind of get renamed right away and continue on.
Are there any preferred tools that you and your team have used for documenting the data flows and the business cases that you're solving with them?
So a lot of the documentation we've built around it has been really focused on trying to rename the tiles to be very descriptive of like kind of what they're or why they're there, or what they're trying to accomplish, which is a hard thing to do sometimes, is trying to like describe why in 2 or 3 words. But rather than trying to go outside of Domo or go to another spot in Domo and try to document it out and get really wordy, we try to keep the documentation actually as close as possible to the tiles and data flows themselves. The other thing that we've been utilizing a little bit, more so on the kind of end of the data flows rather than kind of all the steps in between, is in the data center when you're looking at a data set, there's a tab under its details that's like data, and then you can kind of see a little table preview of the data set right there. There's a schema tab right on that, and that'll allow you to kind of add some descriptions to actual individual columns or tag some of those columns. And one of the things we've done that's been helpful is we'll tag some columns that, okay, these are values that we calculated or created within Domo versus these are not, kind of calculated values. These are coming from a data source that's being pulled into Domo. I think we have a question up here.
Yeah. How often do you use data fusions? And in particular, how do you optimize your data flows in part so that you can then use the indexing functionality of the data fusions for optimizing performance?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what's great about data fusions is they're super fast, but I think their use case is pretty narrow because usually it means that you already have 2 data sources that all you need to do is join these 2 data sources together to see that. And in practice, that doesn't end up helping us a lot of times because we end up needing more than 2 data sources kind of combined together. And then the other downside ends up being that sometimes we want to use these data flows we've built by dimension to supplement other data flows there. And data fusion doesn't lend to that. But if you do have a case where you have 2 data sets and all you really need to do is join them or do pretty simple logic on it, then data fusion is a great option there just because it's fast.
So, question that I have is,
Once I think you had a follow-up question.
oh, go ahead.
Regarding data fusion, so if you had any scalability issues in terms of the number of rows or the size of the data sets you're using?
So he asked if we've had any issues with scalability with data fusion as the number of rows or columns increases. That's actually probably one of the more scalable parts of Domo's data transformation suite as far as how fast they go is. So we've actually not seen any issues there as far as when data sets get bigger. The only time we've really ever ran into any corner cases where we're like, okay, well, we have really too many rows here to process has been in Magic ETL, and usually that's not due to actually having too many rows, but having too many tiles within one data flow. And when they stopped working, it was kind of a sign we needed to look at what was going on, and we actually ended up breaking it up into a couple data flows in a row that were more organized with what was going on in one spot.
So related to that particular question, one of the things I've noticed with the Magic ETL is that, like, for instance, our data sets, we've got tons of data to the point where sometimes some data flows, even a very simple one, could take hours to run. Mm-hmm. What is your approach to dealing with that? And for example, we'll have like 3 data sets that may have 15, 20 million lines of data coming in. And they'll take like 3-4 hours to run sometimes, even on a very simple data flow. What would be the best approach?
So that's a very good question. One approach, specifically if you're in Magic ETL, is to actually kind of go the opposite way of where I was trying to go with data flows by reducing the number of tiles, but seeing where you might be able to filter out chunks into kind of parallel lines and process those separately, because Magic ETL will start to run some of those separate streams in parallel. So that's one thing that you can look into doing to speed it up there. The other thing you can look at is with these data sets that are coming in, how much of this data is actually making it out the other end. If you're filtering on some of that data at the end, you can try to move those filters earlier on so you filter out data after it loads and while it moves further on. The other thing you can look for is if this is data that has kind of duplicate rows in it, and maybe you're merging it together and then filtering out some rows there, you can look at trying to filter down the data set before you even get to the Magic ETL. Because usually when you're in a case like that where you have like 15 million rows on a couple inputs right there, the thing that actually takes forever to run is just loading the data sets into the engine. Once the engine starts running, it's pretty quick. That is one of the things that I keep saying to a bunch of the engineers on the team. So I believe they're pretty close to a way to improve that a lot too, without anyone having to really adjust what they're doing. A lot of I mentioned earlier with kind of optimizing for speed, like the Magic ETL team is working a lot on the infrastructure behind the scenes to speed things up without anyone having to do anything on the user facing end. Part of the reason we found these kind of patterns in the first place is because we had all this happening in one Magic ETL data flow, and it got to the point where like it was too large for Magic ETL to run it. It would just fail. But after a couple phone calls with the engineering team there, they were like, oh, that's good feedback. We found some issues here moving on. What I might suggest is that you ask your CSM if there's anyone that might be able to look at that data flow specifically and give you any advice there.
I was wondering, would you say it's better to try and kind of do everything in one data flow, or if you have a lot of kind of complex logic, would it be better to kind of break those chunks out and then feed it in? And so it's easier to kind of look at the logic and kind of read and kind of find those errors that way?
Yeah, so certainly that's not a cut and dry, kind of solution to that, but usually the trade-off ends up being like, it's nice if we can shove it all into one data flow, because then we don't have to go look at multiple places to kind of get an idea of the context. We can see all of it in one spot. But on the other hand, if it's all in one spot, it can be overwhelming kind of thing. So what I usually try to focus in on is making these data flows kind of like chunked by like how a business person might be thinking about this. So what comes to mind is I have a series of data flows. It's 3 data flows. The first data flow is grabbing some loan payment information out of the accounting system and kind of reformatting it. That's one data flow. The next data flow is just calculating out compounding interest payments on the loan there, because that's kind of the number of transforms in there ends up being pretty complex. But if I'm talking to the president of our company, like, yes, here's what's going on in these data flows. We're kind of organizing our data here in the first one. This second one's where the compounding interest happens, and then this third one we're bringing in maybe construction scheduling data and joining it back in. So kind of breaking down your data flows kind of by how you might describe what they're doing to someone that didn't build the data flow can end up being a way to break that down and organize it. We have another question over here.
So we are a media company. We have like 14 different brands. And if we're doing a data flow for one of our brands, it would just be the data set and it links out to one of the brand's data flows. But if we're doing a master company-wide data flow, is it faster to have each data flow in there or the data sets, or does it not matter?
I mean, it kind of depends there on some of the other requirements around it. So like, that might be something that kind of fits this kind of pine tree pattern pretty well, where you might have some of these separately, but you might see like, okay, well, like this is some transform that we're going to need to do on all of these no matter what. What you can do there is you can focus on those by kind of product, or kind of by brand, by company data flows. You can focus on doing the specific transforms, any cleanup or logic that's specific to that in one data flow. Then you have another data flow that can be each individual business one. And then at the end you have one where you're appending all the ones being processed individually together, and then going to a tile after that and saying, okay, well, here's this one piece of logic that will happen to every one of these right there.
Okay, so we got time for one more question.
Okay, so I'm totally guilty of creating those monstrous data flows, and Samir can confirm that. Reason being is that I noticed that there's a need for similar data with a little bit of tweaks here and there depending on the request. And you mentioned during your presentation that you look for these dimensions, right? So I guess once you find that dimension, what's your thought process when you're creating a data flow? Like, do you tend to go wide and you want everything under the sun, or do you tend to be more strategic as to like, I'm creating this data set for X?
That's a good question. So let's say I'm just starting a new data flow for a dimension. We don't have anything existing. What I'll try to do right off the bat is just bring a bunch of columns through, so I can build a couple cards and just kind of look, okay, this is kind of what we want. But kind of after kind of that quick little prototype there, what I try to do is, okay, well, we want to bring all our data for this dimension kind of through here, but there is a bunch of this stuff that we're joining in that, like, I know we're not going to use or we're not going to use right now. that's a good spot where we can leave those columns off until they're needed down the line. So there's kind of a little bit of a judgment call of, how useful is this kind of column, or where might this be useful? And if it's something that might be useful, well, we can carry it through and do it there. But to kind of put it into perspective a little bit, this jobs table data flow kind of series I was using an example throughout this, it's about 300 columns wide. And it's one of those things where, like, I'm saying all this stuff about like reducing these data flows down, but like that is kind of my last uncharted territory for really doing a big refactor and getting rid of a lot of the stuff that we did before we even thought about organizing our data flows kind of right there. So there's a lot of columns that are coming through that we don't use. If I had to guess, I'd say we probably use 100, 120 of those columns on that right there. The other thing you mentioned is, you say you have like some of these data flows with, by dimension, but then you have like a little twist for, something that someone's doing right there. Good approach to tackle that is that something that could be done on a card? Is that little twist something that could be done at the card level? And if so, then maybe you want to just keep, as detailed as possible with your data flow and use the card to kind of add that little twist. Maybe it's not something that can really be done well on, just the card. Maybe you take most of it through to the end, and then you make a new data flow kind of off the end to do that little twist. That's just the little, spot right there. So that kind of look like a freeway that ends up turning into like a flipped over, kind of pine tree right there. All right, I think we have. Like
Yeah, we're out of time. Thanks you guys so much for coming. Let's give Ryan a round of applause.
And I'll be around for several minutes if anyone has questions they want to come ask me.